My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
For this month's Sound Stories, we once again find ourselves in Seattle in the early 90s. I think the reason why I keep coming back to this era is A, I'm a fan of some of the bands, Alice in Chains in particular, and B, I think it may be the last really big cultural movement involving rock. I just can't think of anything after the so-called grunge movement that really had this all-consuming impact on American culture as a whole, and on the world of music in particular, at least when talking about rock. Obviously, rap/hip-hop's rise to mainstream prominence had a definite impact on American culture and music, but again, I'm specifically talking about rock, and even then I'm not sure if we've seen anything quite like that since either. In fact, I kinda suspect we might not see the like ever again. Between the way music is consumed now and the wide variety of options of genres and subgenres likely makes it impossible for any one kind of movement to capture the national consciousness like that again. Specifically though, in this episode, we're not going to talk about any of the big, most well-known bands to come out of Seattle in the early 90s. Instead, we're going to look into the story of a tragically short supergroup of sorts consisting of members of Alice in Chains, Screaming Trees, and Pearl Jam, all of whom I have covered on this podcast in the past. In fact, this episode is almost a kind of follow-up to the episode on Alice in Chains' Dirt album, as we pick up the tragic tale of their deeply troubled lead singer Lane Staley. Yet before we go any further with our topic today, first like always, I want to give credit to my sources, which include articles by writers like Ken McIntyre, Joe Basso, Jessica Letkeman, Marissa Infallible, Brett Buchanan, Corbin Reef, Kyle Anderson, Rob Lang, and Julian G. Garr. These articles and the various video interviews and the like that I used will, like always, be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all of that being said, let's begin. 1994 for the members of the various Seattle rock bands was what Mike McCready of Pearl Jam would describe as a, quote, strange time. We were all very young and becoming big rock stars, or already were, and there was a lot of partying and abusive things. They had gone from being just a bunch of guys playing music while working construction jobs and working in pizzerias and the like, to having the eyes of a nation more or less trained upon them and their friends. Between the sudden fame, everything that came along with it, and the sudden unexpected suicide of one of their own, it had been a whirlwind couple of years. For Barrett Martin, the drummer for Screaming Trees, his band had finally broken through with their sixth album, 1992's Sweet Oblivion, following which they then spent the majority of the next 2 years more or less touring around the world. At this point, though, the group was taking a break and catching its breath back in Seattle after being on the road for so long. It was during this momentary breather that Barrett got a call from an old friend of his, Mike McCready, who himself had a quite eventful few years after becoming a guitarist for Pearl Jam, a group that very quickly went from being formed to being a massive hit with their debut album 10 in 1991. Pearl Jam hadn't stopped there either, as they had also released 2 more albums, Versus and Vitalogy, since. Along the way, though, Mike had gotten addicted to drugs, seemingly cocaine and alcohol in particular, apparently hitting a low point when his band was putting the finishing touches on the Vitalogy album. It was at that point that McCready decided it was time to go get cleaned up, which involved going to a rehab facility called Hazelden in Minneapolis. Mike, in fact, was just returning to Seattle after completing rehab when he called up Barrett looking to hang out. The pair then went out to dinner, with Barrett thinking that's all this was. Dinner between some old friends who had not had a chance to talk, much less see one another in a while, due to the hectic turns their lives had taken in recent years. What he didn't know was, but would soon find out, is that Mike, while in rehab, happened to meet this really cool bass player named John Baker Saunders. Baker, who was well known in the Chicago blues scene, having worked with local legends like Huber Sublin and Sammy Fender, had pulled up to Hazelden driving a Dodge Dart that had a bumper sticker that read, "What we have here is a failure to give a shit." After seeing this, McCready immediately wanted to get to know this newcomer. However, what really bonded the two was when one night he heard some Bob Dylan music being played in one of the other rooms in the rehab center. This was especially notable because apparently they weren't supposed to play music. So McCready went to investigate and found Baker. The two then got to talking about Dylan and forming a bond right then and there. Mike even stayed with Baker for a time in Minneapolis after they got out of rehab, as he didn't want to return to Seattle right away. However, when it came time to finally head back to his hometown, McCready invited his new friend to come with him, especially since Baker didn't really seem to have anything going on in Minneapolis at the time. Upon arriving in the Pacific Northwest, in part due to his natural cynicism and just general honest and cool nature, seemed to fit right in with the other Seattle musicians. Pearl Jam bassist Jeff Ament even lent Baker one of his basses upon his arrival in the city. Mike also figured that Barrett and Baker would really get along as well, but just as importantly, he wanted the drummer to come and jam with them. He'd always thought Barrett was a great drummer, and really wanted to take this opportunity to play together. Barrett agreed, and things jumped pretty quickly between the three of them. Things went so well that Mike now suggested they should get a singer to come join them and play a couple of shows around town. He even had someone in mind, Lane Staley of Alice in Chains. He just seemed like a natural fit. After all, Baker had long been a fan of the vocalist, while Mike had known him for a decade at this point, and Barrett had gotten to really know Lane when their two bands toured together in '93. You see, both Dirt and Sweet Oblivion had been released within weeks of one another in September of 1992. So in '93, Screaming Trees joined Alice in Chains, opening up for them on their tour for like 9 months. During what was pretty much a world tour, the groups bonded and really became friends, with Barrett noting what a great sense of humor Lane had, and just what a generally sweet person he was. For example, the drummer noted how Lane would consistently make a point of using his guest list to get the kids left outside the arena because they didn't have tickets in to see the show as his personal guests. In addition to these relationships, Lane, like McCready and Baker, had also been in rehab, potentially multiple times at this point. He, though, was still really struggling with his addiction, as reportedly around this time, Alice in Chains had essentially broken up when Lane showed up at practice clearly high after getting out of rehab. A situation that reportedly led drummer Sean Kinney to storm out, swearing he would never work with the troubled singer again. McCready's plan then was for this to be a kind of recovery band, where the three of them could go on this post-rehab journey together and support one another. As for Barrett Martin, while he wasn't in quite the same boat as he had never gone to rehab, his journey wasn't all that dissimilar, as he noted, quote, "We all wanted to stop drinking and using drugs. Mike and Baker had gotten out of rehab. I had just stopped drinking. And you know how it is. You build this mutual support network because everybody's sober and working together and talking about it. You also have to be able to laugh at all the nonsense you got yourself into. And there was actually a good, lighthearted atmosphere of support in that first jam session." Indeed, the first jam session they had was during what Barrett has called the honeymoon period, when you first get sober and you really realize all the things you had been missing out on due to your old bad habits. The hope then was being around all these other sober and recovering musicians may help Lane on his own troubled journey. As for Lane, he just got a call one night about the prospect of playing a show with the other guys, and basically responded that it sounded like fun. His one concern, though, was when were they going to practice? Well, the plan apparently was they'd just get together the night before, and that's when they would figure out what they would be doing the following night before an actual audience. Yet, despite or maybe partially because of this very haphazard approach, they very quickly in their first jam session together just started putting songs together. They had felt a bit of this magic with just the three of them, and Lane seemed to fit in perfectly with McCready, Baker, and Barrett, who said that on the surface at least, the singer looked happy and healthy. In particular, he seemed really excited to do something different for a change. After all, Lane had only ever really been in Alice in Chains, and so this was an opportunity to try some different stuff and to write all by himself without Jerry Cantrell. Now, Lane wasn't alone in experiencing this kind of creative freedom for the first time, as it would also provide a creative outlet for Mike McCready. Pearl Jam, you see, was full of really prolific songwriters, and while Mike wanted to contribute more to the band in that vein, he was kinda too intimidated to do so. This side project, though, was offering him the opportunity to stretch his songwriting muscles without the pressure. This didn't have to live up to or add to the legacy of a band like Pearl Jam. It was free to be its own thing. Now, to be clear, this band, despite having multiple professional musicians who were members of some of the biggest name bands at the time, was only originally supposed to be for fun. In fact, they initially went by the name The Gacy Bunch during their first couple of shows, with The Gacy Bunch being the name McCready came up with at the last minute before their first show as a kind of joke. The name was a reference to serial killer John Wayne Gacy, and a sure sign that at the time they had no higher aims for their group. McCready, you see, had become somewhat fascinated by serial killers after getting out of rehab, so they were obviously on his mind when it came time to call their little group something, with the Gacy Bunch being a name that Mike would ultimately characterize as a joke that was funny for like 5 minutes and then was not funny by the 6th. To fully understand this situation, though, you have to realize that this kind of supergroup seems to have actually been quite common in Seattle in those days. Basically, whenever more than one of these groups got off the road and were back at home at the same time, all these old friends would get together and form temporary little groups that just happened to involve some of the biggest name musicians in popular culture at the time. They would just get together and jam at various little holiday get-togethers in and around the city. For example, Barrett Martin remembers one group that consisted of him on drums, McCready and Kim Thayil of Soundgarden on guitar, and someone like Mark Arm of Mudhoney singing, a group that did not perform in some major venue but in someone's basement in Seattle. Similarly, this new group consisting of him, Baker, Mike McCready, and Lane Staley would just play a couple of relatively secret shows at Seattle's Crocodile Cafe, which looks like it was this little hole-in-the-wall type of venue that, according to Wikipedia, could hold like 550 people. These performances, which to be clear there were less than a handful of, served a dual purpose. They served to help the group tighten up as a band, and they allowed them to try out what they were working on in private on an actual audience. And to be clear, the group of them from seemingly the very beginning were crafting and writing songs together, as things just seemed to gel and come together incredibly fast. There was just said to be this incredible chemistry between all the members of this group, plus it provided them with this very free atmosphere. They simply had none of the pressures or restraints that they had with their normal bands. The ability to just do things for fun seemingly freed them to put stuff together quickly and easily. According to Baker, it was really a collaborative process, where they just kind of fed off what one another were doing and everyone's input was welcome. Over these couple of months then, as it became obvious that maybe there was more to this band than just a simple lark, there was a realization that they might need a better name than the Gacy Bunch. McCready, who had originally come up with the name, then had a suggestion. It was a term he had first picked up when Pearl Jam was in Surrey, England, mixing their first album 10 in 1991. While in Surrey during a break, he went for a walk listening to Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here in Animals on his Walkman, really just enjoying the sensation of listening to those albums while being in England. Between this and whatever substance he may have been on, the bit of rain that came down during his walk really didn't seem to bother him. Some of the locals at the studio, though, would make a comment about it being the mad season, which, as it turns out, was their term for the rainy season, as that's when the hallucinogenic mushrooms sprouted. Mike, upon learning this, thought it was a great term, and so he filed it away, figuring he would find some use for it down the road, and this new band seemed to be the perfect place to use the name. So the group had a name and a plan to start recording on what they had been working on, an idea that seems to have been Lane's, as it seems that Mike initially wanted to just record a demo, but it was the singer who suggested they should skip that and simply record an album. An album that it seems was largely funded off a check the group received from Hollywood Records to record a song for a John Lennon tribute album, with the group ultimately choosing to do I Don't Want to Be a Soldier. As for Mad Season's own album, it would be recorded in just over a week in the Bad Animal Studio in Seattle, a studio owned by Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart, where Mad Season would co-produce the album with the help of sound engineer Brett Eliason, who had previously worked with Pearl Jam. Now, it has to be said that Mad Season didn't really make use of grunge's trick of taking old styles and mixing them up a bit, while also playing them with a harder, more aggressive edge they had borrowed from metal and or punk. The album also doesn't sound like the product of mixing Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains together. Granted, there are some songs that have some hints of those bands in them, but overall, Mad Season is much more laid back and bluesy than those bands. Indeed, the music seems to be heavily blues-influenced, which is likely a product of bass player John Baker Saunders, who had grown up in Alabama before eventually landing in Chicago, both areas that are steeped in the blues tradition. In fact, Mad Season would be the first rock band that Baker had ever been in. Adding to their bass player's bluesy leanings was the fact that their drummer Barrett Martin's favorite bands were Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, groups that were heavily influenced by the blues. Plus, on top of that, Barrett had also been listening to a lot of Delta blues around that time. Mike McCready was in a similar boat, as he had been heavily influenced by the likes of Jimi Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan, two guitarists who had reinterpreted the blues through a rock and roll lens. Plus, it seems like it was kind of fun for the Seattle musicians who were much more hard rock oriented to experiment with a bluesier style. Which is not to say that grunge didn't have some blues elements to it, as they were typically to one degree or another inspired by bands that had themselves been heavily inspired by the blues. It's just this time they were going back more directly to the source.